We are glad to have you this morning, whether you are on Ustream or Facebook Live or watching this on YouTube or listening on the podcast. We're really thankful to have you. We are blessed to be able to do this in this format and these ways to still be able to connect. And I know that Ray put out a short message on the Facebook pages this morning, just kind of announcing, that reassuring everyone that the elders are in communication and in constant prayer and monitoring the situation nationwide and locally as well, and making sure that they have the best information that they can get their hands on, and that they are prayerfully considering what to do and when to do it and how this will all look. We will continue for the foreseeable future. We'll continue the streaming, of course, even when we are fortunate enough to be in a safe and responsible position to get everyone back together physically in this building gathered again. We will continue streaming with the Ustream and Facebook, so that will continue indefinitely. But for the foreseeable future, this is our norm, so to speak, for now. But as I said, the elders are working on that and trying to figure that out, and we'll be sending out more information to everyone soon, just to let everybody know kind of the next step, the next stages, where we're at. This is one of those things where, as you've seen if you've been following along, nobody has a set timetable that is, safe and responsible, and everyone is trying to figure this out. And so continue to be in prayer, whether you are a family member here at Highland View or you are watching and joining us and have a different church family that you're a part of. Pray for the leaders of your church family. Pray for the pastors and preachers and elders and deacons and leadership teams and everyone involved in these decisions. It's stressful, and lots and lots of prayer goes into it. At the end of the day, what we know, I shared on Facebook yesterday, I believe, some of the pieces that I was reading of C.S. Lewis. And he was talking about the body, about the church family, and about how integral everyone is, and how missing just one person from your family, it's not just you are missing a number, but you're missing who that person is and the unique gifts and talents and perspectives that person brings. And so we are unbelievably thankful that even in these times we can stay connected and we can stay together. And the best ways for us to do that, again, continue reaching out to each other through phone calls and email and text messages and letters and cards, and use Facebook and Facebook Messenger and Live and Marco Polo, whatever you've got to stay in touch. And I'm really thankful that we have all these outlets to do that, including the Newsline that played nice this week and updated well. So we're thankful for that too. Continue to be in prayer for all of the family members here and around the world, for leaders and healthcare workers and pharmacists and scientists and researchers and everyone involved in this, that they would continue to use their God-given talents and abilities to make this as safe as possible for all of us. As we get into it this morning, you can go ahead and turn. Grab a Bible, grab your pens and pencils and notebook and markers and crayons and highlighters and whatever you've got, and jump in, underline and highlight and make notes in the margin and write out and share with yourself later on. I love looking back and seeing notes that I made in the past, and I love the idea of someday my kids looking at a Bible that I have written all over one day and looking at it and maybe occasionally getting something from it that they can use, and then I genuinely hope that they can look through and think, my goodness, how in the world did he believe that or get that so wrong? You know, we're always making corrections as we know God more. But turn to Matthew 14. That's where we'll be this morning. So we've had, last week we kicked into this series on even when it hurts. And the slide, which is hopefully showing correct orientation for Ustream and Facebook Live this morning, the idea is that we will always have times. We will always have these seasons where things hurt, where life is just painful. This isn't new for us. It's certainly not new for mankind. This is something that has been from the very beginning of time. I made a very, very short video this morning on Facebook Live just asking us to consider some things. And just a very brief synopsis of even that brief video. Think for yourselves as we go through this series. Look back on your life and consider the times that you went through a season where life just hurt. Sometimes that's a short time. Sometimes it's a day of uncertainty. Aren't those nice? After it's over. Sometimes it's a week. Sometimes it's months. Sometimes it's years. A season of when it just hurts. Sometimes that is medical or health in nature. Sometimes it is grief or pain of loss, a death of a loved one, a loss of a loved one that is still alive, but we have to mourn them in that case. Sometimes it's a tragedy. Sometimes it's a decision that I made that has just wreaked havoc. Sometimes it's a decision that somebody else has made, and their decision has put me into a place of havoc or loss or uncertainty or whatever it is. But think about those seasons and consider, how did you feel before that season began? How did you kind of feel in that season? And it's sort of like the stages of grief. People walk through these stages of grief. We walk through stages of these times where life hurts, where life is painful and uncertain and anxious and fearful and hard. We walk through different stages. I know one of mine, the longest one, that didn't have anything to do with death in the real sense. I had that 2 years basically of unemployment that I've talked about and shared stories before. And you go through the stages. I started out very immediately this brief time of pain, and then I very stoically walked in with hope and optimism and what I called faith. And that quickly turned when that faith and optimism didn't, I put the faith coin into the slot machine. I put the optimism coin into the slot machine. I put the hope coin into the slot machine. I put the hashtag blessed coin into the slot machine, and I pulled the handle and I didn't win. And then I'd spent my coins on the cheap slot machine, and the cheap slot machine didn't give me the answer I wanted, and I quickly turned to more of loss and desperation and abandonment and all of these things, dark places. Think about it for you. Think about seasons that you've had. As we look at Matthew 14, we're going to start in verses 22 through 33. Part of this, the story that leads up to the story that we're focusing on today, is in all four Gospels. This particular story, in some format, some piece or another, is in 3 of them, all of them but Luke. But we're going to look at it in Matthew. Matthew 22, and read this along, and you can make some notes as we continue the message here. But it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. Now, it's important. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go. He commanded them to go. to the other side of the water while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up, Jesus went up on the mountain by himself to go pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way off the land, off the shore, into the middle of the waters. And it was being beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, 3 to 6 a.m., middle of the night, Jesus came to them, walking on the Sea of Galilee. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, it's a ghost. And they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I, don't be afraid. Peter answered, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat, and he walked on the water, and he came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, and he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. So that's our text. That's what we're working from. I introduced this a little bit last week, just this idea of Peter and who Peter is. And we will now kind of break this down and look at the pieces in this. As this starts, right before this event has happened, when he says after this he sent them across, it was the feeding of the 5,000. And this was how they numbered people at this time. They would count the adult males. And so in the adult males, they had 5,000 people. That is not including women and children. So you could easily double, triple, and up this number. We're talking 15,000, 20,000 people. And so there's this feeding of the 5,000, this feeding of this huge multitude, which is another amazing story unto itself. But that's the backstory. That's where we start with this. From there, we have Jesus retreating. This is a theme that permeates all of the New Testament, of Jesus being engaged with people and engaged with crowds and engaged with the disciples and engaged with the 12 and engaged with the 3 and then going away to be alone. It's repeated over and over, and we can read all kinds of things into it. And like everything else in all of Scripture, we always read ourselves into the story, which is good a lot of times. Sometimes it's bad. We read ourselves into the wrong character, but we always kind of view things through our lens. And so different people will view this differently. And I don't think any of it's wrong that I've heard. People will view this as a way of, this is Jesus getting away to spend quiet time. Yes, this is Jesus getting away to kind of refocus and spend time alone with the Father. And Jesus calls God in these prayers often Father when Jesus is praying. And so he's spending that time. For someone like me, I read this as, because again, I read myself into it, right or wrong. This is introvert Jesus. This is Jesus who has been around all the crowds and he is getting away. Is that likely the story? Probably not. But again, I read myself into this, and you can find that you can get an understanding here. But this is Jesus retreating away alone in solitude. Sometimes he retreats from the larger crowd to a smaller crowd. Sometimes he retreats away with the 12. Sometimes he retreats away with the 3, Peter, James, and John. And sometimes, as in this case, he retreats away completely by himself. So he's on the mountaintop, and he's alone. And he has sent the disciples away on a boat. They're in the middle of the sea. Some of this story always was weird to me, because I think of, the sea. I think of lakes, like we've got here. I think of, any of the lakes around Tennessee. And so I never, and honestly, I'm not a boating person. I'm not a fishing person. I like to shoot. I love to hunt. I do not like fish. And part of it is probably because fish don't like me. I'm an excellent fish repellent. And so it just never caught for me. And so I haven't spent tons of time on the water. And times that I do spend on the water in a boat, I usually, my fondest memories of times on the boat, like out on the ocean, are of me staring at the ground like this and, heaving for hours and hours as my vertigo gets the best of me. It's not my thing. And so I never got this idea of a storm on a lake or waves on a lake. It didn't click until several years ago. It was our second trip to Nicaragua. Something else that is not my thing. I have lots of things that are my thing that I love, and I love to research and learn. Something else that is not my thing, geography. Not my thing. And I don't mean world geography, I mean any geography. Hand me a map of the United States of America and I will embarrass myself. The smarter than a fifth grader geography, I am not. And so we land at an airport in Nicaragua, and I certainly don't have the geography of Nicaragua at this time. And we all get off, and we've got some time that we've kind of got to kill before we can get on the school bus and make the trip through the mountains up to Hinatego, where we are going. And so we get taken to the water. Now, we know Nicaragua has amazing beaches, and it's actually, they have surfing and all kinds of things there. And so we go to the edge of the water, and we're sitting there, and all of us, I don't know, about 14 of us, I guess, here from Highland View. And we're looking out at the ocean, and it's pretty incredible. The waves are crashing. You can see nothing, literally nothing but water staring out. It's the ocean. You can't see anything. The waves are crashing against the shore, and we're looking at all this and taking it in. And honestly, there's a lot of trash and junk, and we're, how sad the ocean looks. And finally, Ricardo, who is with us, stops laughing long enough to tell us that it's a lake. It's not the ocean. It's a lake. There are two enormous lakes in Nicaragua, Lake Nicaragua and Lake Managua. And we're at a lake. We're not at the ocean. But that's the first time some of this story clicked for me, because I'm looking at it and the waves are crashing. Waves, not like, hey, the wind's blowing and there's ripples in the water. There are waves crashing on a lake. And I think the lakes in Nicaragua are about 130 feet above sea level. Sea of Galilee, where we are here in the story, is about 700 feet below sea level. 700 feet below sea level, surrounded by mountains. And so the air will come in above the mountains, crash together, and create these enormous storms and waves and surges. And this is where the disciples find themselves, in this enormous storm. Jesus is on a mountain miles away. And I think oftentimes in our storms, whatever our storms look like, even if they are purely self-inflicted storms, our storms, we often feel God is on some mountaintop miles and miles away. Jesus was on a mountain all the way away, spending time alone with God, but Jesus had one ear and one eye in prayer, and one ear and one eye on the disciples. And so, yes, in this story, God was on a mountain miles away. God was alone. God was praying. And God never lost sight of his disciples. God never lost sight of their circumstance. God never lost sight of what was going on. Jesus comes down and he walks across the water. Now, when he does this, he walks across the water. The disciples see him and they flip out. They're immediately terrified. They're screaming. It's a ghost. It's an apparition. It's scary. Fair, right? Like, one, it's the middle of the night. Two, it's a storm. And three, there's a figure walking on top of the water in the middle of the sea. In the middle of the sea, out in this water, here comes somebody walking. They're crying out. They're terrified. So we've now added terror on top of terror. And Jesus says, hey, don't worry about it. It's me. And I found myself asking, and again, they know his voice. But I found myself asking, reading the story, like, if we're the disciples and you don't fully understand who he is, I feel like I'd have some questions. First off, I would want to know, like, okay, but who cares? Like, that's great that you can walk on water, kind of scary, a little weird, fun fact, okay, but we're still in this storm, and who are you that you can say a storm that it's fine? You know, weather freaks us out because we recognize we have no control over it whatsoever. We have no dominion. We have no authority. There is nothing we can do. I have a backyard about the size of a postage stamp. And if it rains for 5 minutes, it is completely unusable. It doesn't matter what I've done, what I'd like to do, what plans I had. It is 3 inches deep of mud for a week if it sprinkles for 5 minutes. Sprinkling 5 minutes. I have no control. There's nothing I can do to stop this. They're in the middle of a sea in a storm that they can't row out of. And the wording here used for the boat is literally that the boat is being shaken. It is shook from front to back, from side to side. There is nothing they can do. They are in the storm, and they're just along for the ride. And here's Jesus that says, hey, it's okay. But here's who he is to say it's okay. In that verse, verse 27, it says the disciples, just before it says the disciples are terrified. They've cried out in fear. And it says, when they cry out in fear, immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, take heart, it is I. That's probably what all of your translations say. The wording here of it is I is the exact same in Greek. It is the exact same as the wording that Jesus uses for all of his I am statements. Jesus is on the water, and Jesus says, take heart, I am. Do not be afraid. That's who he is. That's who can say in the middle of a storm where we can't see anything but waves and terror, I am, can say, don't be afraid. Now, here's some things to consider. In this moment, the disciples are in this huge storm. The storm is wreaking havoc. The boat is being shook side to side, front to back. They're tossed, they're turned. They're exactly where Jesus told them to go. Look back. The very beginning of this. Verse 22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. They were obeying a literal command of God. God said, Jesus said, get in the boat, go to the other side. They were obeying what God said to do. They were obedient in this moment, and they were in a horrendous storm. Let that sink in. I know we all know that theologically, right? Like, we can know that as a matter of, like, okay, that's a thing. But man, it's hard to hold on to that if we're in the storm. Because I guarantee every time any of us have ever been in a storm in our life, whether it was an immediate reaction, a delayed reaction, or a very, very delayed reaction, all of us at some point, at some moment, have gone through every storm and looked at, where did I miss it? Where did I go wrong? What did I mess up? How did I not hear God? I thought I heard God, but clearly I couldn't have heard God because I thought God said to do this thing, but this thing has brought me into a storm, so clearly I heard him wrong. But these people didn't hear him wrong. These people heard Jesus say, go, get in this boat, push off of this shore, go into this sea, and go on this route. They heard correctly, they were obedient, they followed the orders, and they found themselves in a terrible storm. They didn't bring on the storm. They didn't cause the storm. Their lack of obedience didn't cause a storm. They were fully obedient in what they were doing. They also had no power to control that storm. That storm did not care if any of them stepped up and said, I am Peter, I am John, I am Mary, whoever's in the boat. Like, they don't care. The storm does not care at all. They had no power to control this boat whatsoever. They found themselves in the middle of a storm while they were in the middle of God's will. The eye of the hurricane was still the center of God's will. Is that always the case? No. I can make some storms on my own. I can't stop them on my own sometimes, but I can cause it. But that's not all the time. That's not the rule. The center of God's will was the center of this storm. So Jesus is on the water. He says, don't be afraid, I am. Peter calls out, love it. You can read, and again, we all read ourselves into this, and we read our perception of the characters in this. And so I have heard the sermons, and I've seen people, and they said Peter steps up, puts his foot on the edge of that boat. He says, Jesus, if it's you, call me, I will come. It's possible. I don't think this was some well thought out plan. I think this is Peter, again, me reading in, I think this is Peter being Peter, where Peter never thinks before he speaks, ever. And he's like, all right, fine, if it's you, call to me. And Jesus says, come. Now understand, when Jesus says come, this isn't a, sure man, like if you want to try it. This isn't a, if it's up to you, yeah, go ahead. No, this is emphatic. Peter said, Lord, if it's you, what does that word in your translation say? Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus obliges. He issues a command. It is a command. Peter, come. Now, I don't know what happens then. I don't know if Peter just reckless, just like everything else. Either way is just as likely, right? Like, it's likely that Peter just leaps out of the boat. And it's also likely, I think, that Peter then starts looking around at everyone else in the boat like, did he really say that? Did I really just sign myself up for this? But Jesus says, all right, Peter, put your money where your mouth is. Come. Come. Peter gets out of the boat. And he walks on water. Because Peter's faith was so great? Maybe. He walks on water because Jesus let him walk on water. Peter leaps out that boat. He's the only one that does. He gets out of the boat and he walks on water. Now the storm hasn't stopped. For some reason, every time I read this story growing up, it was like two separate stories. It was the disciples were in a boat and there was a huge storm, and then Jesus is walking on the water, and that water, and every time I've envisioned this story, that water is like glass. You know, it's sunshine, it's the middle of the day, calm, still, glassy water, and Jesus is just walking. But these aren't two separate stories. The disciples are in a boat being tossed and thrown by the waves, and Jesus is walking on the water in that storm. This is one thing. This is middle of the night, storm coming, waves crashing, wind roaring, and Jesus walking through these waves of this storm and calling to Peter. And again, it's also not that the waves were, there was no waves, the water was glassy, the sun was shining, the birds were chirping, there was a rainbow behind Jesus. Peter gets out of the boat, he gets halfway, then Jesus snaps and the waves come. No. The storm was there when Peter jumped out of the boat. The storm was there when Peter took his first few steps walking on water. Peter then starts to pay attention to the storm, and he starts to sink. And Jesus snatches him up. Read this little encounter again. But when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid. Beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took him, and pulled him out. He didn't wait. Jesus didn't wait. He didn't make sure that the consequences of Peter's action caught up with him and he nearly drowned first, and right as he had one air bubble left, he pulled him out and said, "I told you so." That's not how the story goes. It says Peter cried out, "Lord, save me," and immediately Jesus grabs him and pulls him up. And then he does say, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" You can read that sentence a lot of different ways too. Text messages are a terrible form of communication because you can't read inflection, but you can make it up. We can't read inflection, but we can make it up. And I believe many times Jesus will make a statement, and the inflection that you read is how you believe God is. Same in the Hebrew Bible. God will say something, you will read it with the inflection of how you know God. So you can read this with the inflection of Jesus snatching him up, getting in his face as that parent who just told him to do something and then he gave up and sank, and going, "You've got no faith, what's wrong with you?" But I don't think it fits. I think he pulls him up. He pulls him up with a smile and a pat and goes, "Oh man, come on." I think this is you all, if you're Highland View family members, Aaron and I have 2 daughters, and despite the fact that they share identical DNA sources and live in the same home and grew up in the same church and went to the same school, they shared almost nothing in common, personality-wise whatsoever. One of them is Aaron's twin and one of them is my twin, and I don't have to tell anyone which one's which. Paisley, helping her ride her bike. She decided she wanted to ride her, no training wheels. And so, I'm helping her and I'm holding the seat a couple of times because we can only do it about once. And I don't mean one training session. I mean I can hold that seat and she can move about 3 feet and then she'll stop. Because she'll get going, she'll go 3 feet and she'll slam on the brakes. Everything's going great and she can't fall anyway because I'm holding the seat. If she stops doing everything, she's still fine, but she will slam on those brakes and stop. Because she's scared to death that she's going to fall because, now get this, not because she doesn't know how to ride a bike, but she's not sure if I know how to hold her up. Now, I could get mad, and occasionally did. I'm come on! If you just pedal, you'll keep going. Every time you stop the brakes, the same thing happens. But I can also realize that Paisley's doubt is she doesn't know if I know how to hold that bike. Now, she knows that I can throw her 10 feet up in the air and catch her with one hand, much to her mother's horror. But she doesn't know if I can hold that bike up without it falling over. She's not sure. And so she learned how to ride a bike the first time she ever tried on her own. She didn't want any help. She literally, like, after we did this a couple times, she just worked herself because she trusted herself more. And when she would first take off and when she would fall, because she wasn't sure if she could trust me to hold it, mine wasn't a, I told you so. It was, why on earth? You've seen the things that I can do. You know how much I love you. Why on earth would you not trust me to hold this bike where you won't fall? Jesus snatches Peter out of that water. Why on earth would you not know that I'm not going to let you sink? See, here's the other thing that I read in this verse forever. I always read in this verse when he says, you of little faith. Of course, what it is that Peter had faith. He jumped out of the boat, and then he lost his faith, and so he lost his faith that he could walk on water, and so he sank. And so Jesus picks him up, and he reprimands him for his loss of faith that made him sink. Literally this morning, reading through this passage, I came to the realization that I'm not sure that's correct. Literally this morning, praying through this and reading through this, the Holy Spirit, taps me on the shoulder and shows me this. And again, this is me speaking into a text. But I'm not sure that you of little faith is connected to him losing his faith and sinking. I think that it's connected to him crying out, God, I'm about to drown because I don't know if you can hold this bike seat or not. It says as he begins to sink, he cries out, Lord, save me. I really think that in this moment, Peter, you of little faith, I really think this is Jesus saying, you think you had to ask? I think this is Jesus' reaction to Peter crying out, Lord, save me, please. Jesus is going, are you kidding? You think you've got to ask? You think I'll just stand here and let you drown because you can't pedal the bike on your own? Of course you can't walk on water, Peter. Only I can do that. You can only do that because of me. So you think I'm going to let you drown because you're you? This is a father looking at his child saying, you think I'm going to let you drown because you are you? Because at your age and your size and your ability, you can't physically, literally do something, and you think because of that, I'm just going to let you drown? Oh, Peter, where's your faith in me? Because the other part of the story, of course, is Paisley actually has plenty of faith in her. That's why she learned to ride the bike eventually on her own. She wasn't sure she had faith in me in that moment. We know Peter's not talking about having faith in Peter's ability to walk on water. Peter wasn't sure if Jesus could hold him up. Wasn't sure if Jesus would save him. So, from bad to worse, to secondhand courage, to firsthand fear, to fearfully and wonderfully saved, to reprimanded or reminded and reassured, that last line on the slide there. So they're in the storm. The storm is terrible. Then a ghost shows up and it goes from bad to worse. And then Peter jumps out of the boat, not because of his courage. Paisley didn't jump on the bike with no training wheels because of her courage. Her initial jump on there was because of secondhand courage that I gave her. Peter jumps out of that boat because of secondhand courage. He saw Jesus, he focused on Jesus, and Jesus gave him courage. I've referenced several times, the Chronicles of Narnia books, and parts of that's like, I love them, and I love what they teach about who God is and how all this works, and I'm reading through them with Paisley. We're in Prince Caspian right now, and there's a place in there where Aslan returns. Jesus returns, and it says that they were themselves, the kids, Edmund and Peter and Susie and Lucy, and they were themselves, and it says, and the lion breathed on them, and all of a sudden they were something else. They were filled with courage that wasn't their own. Peter had secondhand courage to jump out of that boat and go. But then he encountered first-hand fear, and he started to sink. He was snatched up and saved, and he was not reprimanded. I do not believe that this is a reprimand on any way to read this, that this is a reprimand of Peter. Peter is being reminded and reassured. What is our problem? My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken their first love. They have forgotten their first love. And they have looked for life in places that don't hold it. Cisterns that won't hold water. We forget. Moses and the Israelites, they forget. We forget. We see God show up. We see Jesus on the water, and we get secondhand courage, and we jump out of the boat, and we land. Peter landed like it was concrete. But then he forgot. The punishment of forgetting, got scared because he tried to do it on his own for a minute. But then what does Jesus do? The same thing God has done since the Garden of Eden. God reminds and reassures. God reminds, this is who I am. This is my character. And God reassures that it's about God's character, not ours. Why does God say not to be afraid? God says, do not be afraid because I am. And again, this isn't God saying don't be afraid because I'm afraid. If you're watching and unfamiliar with this weird kind of terminology and strange grammar, this is Jesus, this is God saying, I am. It's a statement, it's a name, it's Yahweh. I am is this idea that I have always been, not before Abraham, before everything. I have always been. I am right now, right in front of you, and I will always be. I just simply am. I am the existent. So do not be afraid because I am. Not because you are strong, not because you are brave, not because you are courageous. There's no football pep talk and there's no self-esteem boosting pep talk. There's none of that. It's don't be afraid because I am your God. I am. Sometimes the storm is right where we were sent. I've joked about it before, but I'd love to see someone attempt with a straight face to tell Paul that the safest place on earth is a sinner of God's will. It's not. It's not. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the opportunity to gather in a digital way, that we have options and abilities to still hang out, to still hear from one another, to still share with one another, to still be a part of each other's lives. We thank you for the stories that you've given us. We thank you for the example of who you are that you give us. We thank you for your constant patience as we look back at I Am, as we look back at the God who created the cosmos, who sprang life into existence, and who threw stars across galaxies undiscovered, that we look back at that God who created galaxies upon galaxies upon galaxies, and we say, I'm just not, I don't know if you can hold this bike seat. We thank you for your patience with us. We thank you even more that you have patience with us because you love us, not for anything else. We thank you that this is about your character and not our character. We thank you for this Highland View family. Everyone tuned in today, everyone watching is family. And they're family because of you. We thank you for who you are in any and every storm, because you are I Am. God, give us courage and hope because of you, not because of us or because of anything else. God, don't give us strength. Just give us you. When I'm in a really strong place, I'm rarely as connected with you. You say it. Your grace is sufficient. Your power that is sufficient is made perfect in our weakness. Father, help us to have this time where we recognize that you are God in any and every storm. Sometimes we make the storm. Sometimes someone else makes the storm. But not every time we find ourselves in a storm is it some form of error or punishment. Help us to look for you in every storm because you are there. You are in every field, every valley, every mountain, every peace, every calm, every storm. You walk through the valley of the shadow of death with us. You walk through crashing waves on top of stormy waters to get to us. Help us to remember your character and how your character sees us. In Christ's name, amen. I love you guys. Thanks for being with us, and please share with one another. Send in prayer requests so that we can be praying for you. Send in questions that come up in your Bible studies and questions that come up in the sermons. Send things that stuck out to you, things that you highlighted and underlined and marked and connected to something else. What did God show you? What did the Holy Spirit whisper in your ear? I am so thankful for these times in Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights and throughout the week on Facebook Live, and I'm genuinely really thankful for them and love being with you guys. Love you.